Have you ever driven through a small town late at night? The streets are empty, the shops are closed, and the houses sit in silence. Almost too silent. At first glance, it feels safe, cozy, even. But if you stay long enough, you realize something unsettling. Small towns have shadows just as dark as the cities, and sometimes, they're even harder to escape. Welcome back, friends. Tonight, I've got something special for you. 3 stories pulled from the quiet corners of America. The kinds of places where everyone knows everyone. Where secrets linger behind painted fences and church bells. The kind of towns where, if something goes wrong, it isn't a stranger you should fear. It's the people you wave to every single day. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. You don't want to miss what's coming. Because these stories, they're the kind that stick with you long after the video ends. In our first tale, we'll step into the shoes of a gas station worker who learns the chilling reason why no one in town dares to be outside after midnight. It's not just superstition, it's survival. In the second story, a group of teens chasing thrills make the mistake of sneaking into an abandoned house on Miller Road. They thought it was just a local legend. They thought wrong. And in the last story, we'll meet a man who moves to a quiet town for peace and comfort, only to discover that the friendly neighbors smiling at him across their porches are hiding something far, far darker than he ever imagined. So grab a blanket, turn off the lights if you dare, and settle in. Because the stories you're about to hear prove one thing. Small towns may look peaceful on the surface, but sometimes, the things that lurk beneath are far worse than anything the city could ever hold. Remember to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with someone who thinks small towns are safe. Because small towns keep their secrets, but sometimes, those secrets don't want to stay buried. Ethan wasn't from this small town. He was just a guy in his early 20s, saving up for college, working the night shift at a gas station on the edge of a rural highway. It was the kind of place where cars passed maybe once or twice an hour after dark, where the only real company you had was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the smell of gasoline hanging in the air. The locals had their quirks, sure. Everyone knew each other by name, and everyone had the same warning for Ethan once they found out he'd be working nights. Don't go outside after midnight. First, he laughed. He thought it was just one of those small-town superstitions like ghost stories kids tell around a campfire. People said it with a straight face, though. Old men in overalls, mothers buying milk at 11:45. Even the sheriff who filled up his patrol car at dusk. Ethan didn't believe in curses or ghosts. He believed in overtime pay. But the way everyone's tone dropped, the way their eyes flicked toward the dark highway when they said it, it was enough to keep the idea in the back of his mind. Still, he told himself it was nothing. Just small-town gossip. Just fear passed down through generations. And yet, when the clock ticked closer to midnight, he couldn't help but notice how quiet everything became. Build-up almost equals 380 words. It started subtly. Customers who came in after 10 o'clock never lingered. They grabbed what they needed, avoided small talk, and always glanced at the clock before leaving. By 11:30, the station was empty. By 11:45, the highway itself seemed deserted. Ethan thought maybe it was just habit. Maybe people wanted to be in bed early. But one night, curiosity got the better of him. He watched the security cameras as the minutes ticked toward midnight. At 11:58, the feed flickered. Static swallowed the picture for a few seconds, and when it cleared, the angles were slightly off. The parking lot looked stretched somehow, as though the poles holding up the roof were bent. He blinked, shook his head, and chalked it up to bad wiring. Still, the pattern continued every night. Always at the same time, always that same distortion. Then came the newspaper. Ethan was cleaning out an old drawer behind the counter when he found it. A yellowed clipping folded between receipts. The headline read, "3 local teens vanish on Highway 14. The story dated back nearly 30 years. According to the article, they were last seen stopping at this very gas station. The search turned up nothing. When Ethan asked his coworker, a guy named Dale who'd been there for years, the color drained from his face. Dale muttered something about not messing with old things and letting the night have what it wants. The next week, Dale didn't show up for his shift. Rumor was he'd quit without notice. That left Ethan alone. Alone with the empty parking lot, the flickering cameras, and the ticking clock. And no matter how hard he tried to laugh it off, he couldn't shake the feeling that the warnings weren't just superstition. They were survival rules. Climax. Almost equals 370 words. It happened on a Tuesday. Midnight came, and for once, Ethan's curiosity outweighed his caution. He wanted proof. Something to show that the town's fear was nothing more than small-town paranoia. So at exactly 12:01, he pushed open the glass door and stepped outside. The air was heavy, colder than it should have been for early summer. The night sky looked smeared, like someone had dragged a hand across wet paint. The crickets had gone silent. Even the buzzing lights of the station seemed quieter, like the sound had been sucked away. First, there was nothing. Just the pumps standing tall under the fluorescent glow, and the road stretching into endless black. He almost laughed, almost went back inside. Then he heard it. A whisper. It wasn't words, at least not in any language he recognized. It was layered, distorted, like voices overlapping on an old tape. He spun around, searching, and that's when he saw them. Shadows moving at the edges of the lot. Not cast by anything, not connected to any figure. Just shadows, sliding across the pavement, bending wrong, stretching too long. They circled him, closing in. Shapes began forming from them. Human-sized, human-shaped, but wrong. Their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their faces, or what should have been faces, were hollow, smooth, blank. Ethan's chest tightened as one of them drifted closer, inches from his face. He stumbled backward, bolting for the door. His key fumbled in his shaking hand, but he managed to shove himself inside and slam it shut. That's when the glass bowed. Not cracked, bowed inward, as though invisible hands pressed against it. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him, filling his ears until he thought he'd go mad. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The glass snapped back. The shadows were gone. The world outside looked normal again. Aftermath almost equals 210 words. Ethan didn't last the week. He handed in his badge, packed up his things, and left town without saying goodbye. But the faces, he still saw them. In reflections, in dreams, in the dark corners of rooms where shadows don't belong. Years later, he admitted the truth over a drink to a friend, that he had ignored the warnings, that he had seen them. And his voice cracked when he said the part that still haunted him. They weren't just outside. For a moment, just before the glass snapped back into place, he swore one of those faceless shapes had slipped through. The gas station is still there today, still lit up at night like a beacon on the empty road. But if you pass by after midnight, you'll notice something strange. The doors are always locked. The clerk always sits behind the counter, refusing to look outside. And if you linger too long, you might hear it too. That faint whispering in the distance, growing closer, waiting for you to step outside. So, would you take that chance? And if you're still here with me, don't forget to subscribe, because the next story proves the gas station wasn't the only place in that town hiding something horrifying. Back in the late 90s, before smartphones and constant internet, boredom in a small town could be brutal. That's probably why 4 friends, Ryan, Jenna, Mark, and Chris, decided one summer night to finally check out the house on Miller Road. Everyone in town knew the legend. The house had been abandoned for decades, sagging on its foundations, windows blackened, roof caving in. Parents warned their kids to stay away, but that only made it more tempting. The story went like this: years ago, a family lived there. They were normal enough until suddenly, they weren't. Neighbors reported screams, strange chanting, lights flickering at odd hours. Then, one night, the house went quiet. No one saw the family again. Since then, anyone stupid enough to spend the night there never came back the same. Some were found wandering the woods, catatonic, unable to explain what happened. Others were never found at all. Ryan had just bought a bulky camcorder with his part-time job money, and he was eager to use it. Jenna, the bravest of the bunch, said she wasn't scared. Mark and Chris weren't about to be the ones who chickened out. So, on a muggy Saturday night, armed with flashlights, cigarettes, and bravado, they pushed open the creaking gate of the Miller Roadhouse and stepped inside. Build-up almost equals 380 words. The first thing they noticed was the smell. Damp, rotting wood mixed with something metallic, something that clung to the back of their throats. "Smells like something died in here," Mark muttered, covering his nose. Ryan laughed nervously and held up the camcorder, recording every detail. Through the small viewfinder, the house looked even worse. Peeling wallpaper hung in strips. Furniture lay broken, like it had been smashed deliberately. Strange symbols, circles, jagged lines, were carved into the walls, deep enough to leave scars in the wood. Jenna traced one of them with her finger. "Looks like, I don't know, some kind of ritual, or bored kids," Chris said quickly, but his voice was shaky. They moved deeper into the house, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The floorboards groaned under every step. Somewhere above them, something shifted, the unmistakable creak of footsteps. They froze. "Hello," Ryan called out, half joking, half hoping no one answered. Silence. "Probably raccoons," Jenna said, though she didn't sound convinced. In the dining room, Chris found a diary lying beneath a pile of rubble. The cover was stiff, water-stained, but the pages inside were still legible. The entries started out normal. Grocery lists, chores, reminders about school. But as they flipped through, the tone changed. "There's something in the walls. It watches us at night. I can hear it breathing. We tried to leave. The doors won't open." The final entry was just one sentence, scrawled in jagged handwriting that tore into the page. "It won't let us go." Chris slammed the diary shut. "Okay, that's enough. Let's get out of here." The others didn't argue. But when they turned back toward the front door, something was wrong. It wouldn't open. Climax almost equals 370 words. Ryan twisted the doorknob until his knuckles turned white, but it wouldn't budge. Chris shoved his shoulder against the wood, but it didn't move an inch. "It's stuck," he panted. "Break a window," Jenna snapped. But when they ran to the living room, every window they'd passed on the way in was bricked up from the outside. Not boarded, bricked, like the house had been sealed shut. The lights overhead flickered. For a second, they swore the house groaned, like it was alive. Then Ryan screamed. They spun around, but he was gone. One moment, he'd been holding the camcorder, recording everything. The next, there was only the camera lying on the ground, the red recording light blinking. "Ryan," Jenna called, her voice breaking. A muffled sound came from the walls. Pounding. A scream. "Oh my God," Chris whispered. "He's in the walls." The sound grew louder, frantic, like someone was clawing from inside. Mark backed away, flashlight trembling. "We have to leave. Now." The ceiling above them creaked. Something was moving. Slowly, deliberately. Jenna's beam caught it first. A pale, contorted figure crawling down the ceiling like a spider, head twisted completely backward, eyes wide and milky white. It opened its mouth, and Ryan's scream came out of it. That was all it took. The three of them bolted down the hallway, smashing into furniture, yanking at locked doors. The thing above them scuttled across the ceiling, keeping pace, its limbs bending in unnatural angles. They reached a back room, its window covered with heavy boards. Chris grabbed a rusted chair and slammed it against the wood. The boards splintered, again, until finally, one cracked loose, letting in the humid night air. Jenna and Chris shoved Mark through first, then scrambled after him as the thing dropped from the ceiling behind them, its hands slapping against the floor. They didn't look back. Aftermath almost equals 210 words. They ran until their lungs burned, not stopping until Miller Road was far behind them. Mark and Jenna collapsed on the curb, gasping for air, while Chris turned back toward the house. From the outside, it looked exactly the same as it always had, dark, silent, still. No sign of Ryan. They went back the next day with Ryan's older brother and a few other kids. But the house was different. The front door stood wide open, the room's empty. No diary, no symbols, no camera. The police wrote it off as a runaway case, just another teen who decided to vanish. But Jenna, Mark, and Chris knew better. They had heard Ryan's screams. They had seen the thing that wore his voice. As for the house on Miller Road, a few years later it was torn down. An empty lot sits there now, grass growing over the rubble. But locals say if you stand there on a quiet night, you can still hear pounding from underground. And sometimes, just sometimes, a voice calling out. Not for help, not for escape, but for you. And if you're still with me, make sure you're subscribed, because the next story isn't about a house or a gas station. It's about the neighbors you trust every single day, and what happens when you realize they're not who they seem. Daniel wasn't looking for excitement. After his divorce, all he wanted was peace. A quiet place where he could put the pieces of his life back together. That's why he moved to a small town he'd found online. Population, barely 2,000. Cheap rent. A cozy little house at the edge of town. Perfect. At first, it felt like he'd found exactly what he was looking for. The neighbors were friendly. Very friendly. Within a week, he'd been invited to 3 dinners, 2 barbecues, and had enough pies dropped off at his doorstep to feed an army. "Welcome to our town," they all said with identical smiles. It was nice, but there was something about it that felt off. Too perfect. They stopped by without knocking. They asked personal questions. And more than once, they invited him to something called the Midnight Gathering. Daniel always laughed it off, saying he needed to settle in first. But every time he said no, their smiles seemed to linger just a little too long. He told himself he was being paranoid. After all, wasn't this what he wanted? A community that cared. A fresh start where he wouldn't feel so alone? But late at night, staring out his window, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he'd walked into something he didn't understand. Build-up almost equals 380 words. It started with the church bell. Every night at midnight, it rang once. Low, heavy, almost vibrating through his bones. Daniel noticed that when it did, the town went quiet. Porch lights switched off. Streets emptied. And from his window, he could see shadows moving toward the church at the center of town. Everyone went. Every night. When he asked about it casually, the answers were always the same. "Oh, that? Just tradition. No big deal. You'll join us soon enough." He let it go for a while, but curiosity gnawed at him. So one night, he decided to see for himself. He left his lights on and pulled the curtains, making it look like he'd gone to bed. Then, careful not to make a sound, he slipped out the back door and crept through the dark streets until he reached the church. The doors were already open, light spilling out. Inside, the entire town stood in a circle around something at the center of the floor. Daniel edged closer, heart pounding, until he could finally see it. Pit. A massive, perfectly round pit, black as ink, carved straight into the floorboards. The townspeople held lanterns, their faces glowing in the flickering light, as they chanted words Daniel didn't recognize. The sound wasn't like normal voices. It was layered, deep, almost vibrating the air around him. The pit seemed to drink in the sound, pulsing as if alive. Daniel backed away slowly, terrified, trying not to breathe too loudly. But the floor creaked beneath his foot. Dozens of heads snapped toward him at once. Climax. Almost equals 370 words. The next morning, the town felt different. The smiles were still there, but they were colder now, stretched too wide, eyes that didn't blink enough. When Daniel tried to drive out of town, his car wouldn't start. Someone had cut the wires. When he picked up the phone, there was no dial tone. His internet? Dead. Everywhere he went, people watched him. They waved. They smiled. But there was no warmth anymore, only hunger. That night, the church bell rang again. And before he could even decide what to do, he heard it. Footsteps outside his house. Dozens of them. They didn't knock. They didn't call his name. Not at first. Then, in unison, they began chanting. "Daniel! Daniel!" He bolted. Out the back door. Into the woods. Branches tore at his clothes as he sprinted, heart hammering. Behind him, the glow of lanterns weaved between the trees. Voices followed, growing louder. Daniel! Daniel! They were everywhere. To his left, to his right, closing in. He stumbled over roots, crashing into the dirt, scrambling back to his feet. He didn't dare look back, but he could hear them. Too close. Too many. He pressed himself behind a fallen tree, chest heaving, trying to stay silent. The lantern light washed over the forest floor just feet away. The chanting grew louder, then softer, moving past him. Daniel stayed there, shaking, until the sky began to lighten, until the lanterns disappeared, and the birds started to sing again. When he finally staggered out of the woods at dawn, the town looked perfectly normal. Neighbors mowing lawns, kids riding bikes, smiles as warm as ever. But now Daniel knew better. Aftermath almost equals 210 words. He left that same day, hitching a ride with a trucker on the highway. He never returned for his car, his house, or the pies that still sat rotting on the porch. He went to the police, of course, tried to explain what he saw. The chanting, the pit, the lanterns in the woods. They looked into it, reported back a week later that nothing unusual was found. The church was empty, they said. No pit, no gatherings, nothing out of the ordinary. Daniel wanted to believe them, but deep down he knew what he saw. He knew what they were hiding. Weeks later, out of curiosity, he checked online. The house he'd rented was listed again, already occupied by someone new. Another outsider looking for peace. Another soul walking into the same trap. And then the letters started arriving. No return address. Just a neat, handwritten script. "We miss you, Daniel. You'll always have a place here." Signed, "Your neighbors." So, if you ever move to a small town that seems just a little too perfect, ask yourself, is it really kindness? Or are they waiting for you to join them at midnight? And before you go, make sure you're subscribed, because the next story might be the one that makes you question the town you live in right now. And there you have it, 3 stories from small towns that remind us why some roads are better left untraveled, and why the quietest places often hide the loudest secrets. Think back to Ethan, the gas station worker who learned, far too late, why the town never dared step outside after midnight. The warnings weren't superstition. They were survival. Then there were the teens on Miller Road, laughing, filming, thinking it was all just another story to scare kids at sleepovers. But they found out the hard way that legends are often warnings dressed as entertainment. And not everyone comes back from testing them. And Daniel, the man who only wanted peace after a rough chapter in his life. Instead, he discovered that friendly neighbors weren't neighbors at all. At least, not in the way we think. The thread tying all of these together is chilling. Small towns feel safe because everyone knows each other. But if darkness lives there, then everyone knows, and they'll do anything to keep it quiet. Next time you're driving through a little town, pay attention to the details. The boarded-up house no one talks about. The smiles that feel just a little too wide. The warnings that sound more like rules. Because you might not just be passing through, you might be stepping into their secret. If these stories gave you chills, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell, so you don't miss the next time we dive into the shadows. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and trust me, there are plenty more waiting in the dark. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the scariest places aren't always the ones that look dangerous. Sometimes they're the ones that look perfectly normal. Sweet dreams, if you can.